This session is part of the Indie Author Fringe Conference, a 3 times a year author conference fringed to the major publishing fairs London Book Fair, Book Expo America and Frankfurt Book Fair. The Indie Author Fringe is run under the stewardship of the Alliance of Independent Authors, is organised by writers for writers and is free to attend. Let's see who's sharing self-publishing insights in this session.
Hello and welcome to our next session for Indie Author Fringe. This one's called Payments to Authors, something close to everybody's heart, Past Campaigns and Future Possibilities. I'm Orna Ross, Director of the Alliance of Independent Authors, reporting to you here from Frankfurt. And I'm really pleased to be bringing you this session with 2 key campaigners who have long had author interests at heart. The theme for our Indie Author Fringe Frankfurt Book Fair 2017 is, I think you know, running an indie author business. And the fact that we can run an author business at all rests on key concepts of intellectual property, copyright, lending right, and many other concepts that have been long fought for by campaigners and activists, authors themselves and people who cared about author payment and who felt that authors, as the creators of the work, were entitled to payment for the value inherent in that work. So their work as campaigners really, and what they have managed to make happen for us, we can only take advantage of that if we understand 2 things: that we are in the intellectual property business and what that means, and that we are the creative director not only of our books but also of our businesses and what that means. And so this session is all about contextualizing that. I'm going to be talking to 2 really interesting and important people in this context, Maureen Duffy and Barbara Hayes. And they are going to talk to us about 2 specific payment campaigns for authors. One, PLR, Public Lending Right, and the other, the Author Licensing and Collecting Society, which pulls in payment for authors in contexts like photocopying and other things like that, whereas PLR focuses in on payments to writers whenever somebody borrows a book in a library. And Maureen and Barbara both work in the UK, but they both travel extensively around the world through their work because copyright is an international issue and there are people all over the world trying to do things. And in many ways the US and the UK are a little bit further ahead in some ways than other countries, and learning and growing and developing from the information of the things that are happening in other countries. And they both work for the International Authors Forum, as well as these 2 organisations that we're going to be hearing about now on those 2 key campaigns for authors. So Maureen, first of all, if I can introduce her to you, she is a distinguished writer, a novelist, a poet, a playwright. She's been at the forefront of international campaigns for author rights for decades, literally. And I've long been an admirer of Maureen's work. She really does range across every form that it is possible for writers to write in, almost. She was one of the first openly lesbian novelists in the UK. She's a brave and vocal campaigner, and I began by asking her, how did public lending right come about, and what happened back in the 1960s that this campaign was set in motion?
People have been agitating about this for some time, and eventually the Arts Council came up with a proposal that was that something should be added to the price of each book that the libraries bought, and that should go to the publishers, and they might pass a little something on to us. This absolutely infuriated Bridget Brophy, whose father had been one of the campaigners for public lending right. He came up with a scheme that was dubbed the Brophy Penny. And she was appalled by this suggestion that money should be paid to the publishers. And I was too, because in those days we used to get advances from publishers, and all monies that came in went towards paying off the advance. So that would have meant that we'd have got nothing from PLR anyway. So we started a campaign, and we built up a pressure group called Writers' Action Group, or WAG, because we had to hoped to be the tail that wagged the dog. And we set about gathering support in Parliament. We were very lucky in having the ennobled writer Ted Willis on our side, and also Michael Foot, who was very important indeed. He was then leader of the House, and in having a Labour government at the time. And so we set about devising a scheme. First of all, we said that the money should come from government if it was thought to be a social good, not from the library budgets, which would simply mean they bought fewer books. And then I began to study computers, which, as anybody who knows me will cause them to roll about in hysterical mirth. I took Computer Weekly, and I was told that, computers won't be here for another 20 years. And I said, well, they're using something at supermarket checkouts, so it must be possible to use it. And then we decided that it would be impossible to gather data from all the public libraries, because in those days the loans were about 700,000 a year. And so we contacted a statistician and got him to devise a sample of the whole country, which would give us plus or minus 2% accuracy. And so we started going to the Minister for the Arts and so on with our proposals, and we staged some street theatre with St George and the Dragon outside the Minister for the Arts, and we had people like Kingsley Amis carrying banners, totally against his usual political position, and we were supported by all sorts of people like Graham Greene, for instance. And so we built this campaign, and Ted Willis was able to introduce questions into the House of Lords and put down motions and things of that kind. And in the end, Michael Foot, who understood what we were trying to do, took us to see the Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, who said it would be a great help to me, and I could, be more positive, if you could get the support of the Trade Union Congress. And so, using the in of the Writers' Guild, which is an affiliated trade union, I was able to put down a motion to the Trade Union Congress, go to the Congress that year, get up and speak to this huge assembled audience of steel workers and miners and etc., 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 all of which we had in those days. And I managed to get them to accept the motion, and so we were able to go back to Jim Callaghan and say, we've got it, and he said, right. And so the legislation was introduced and passed as almost the last act of that Labour government before it fell. There's a lot more about public lending, right, but I want to just briefly say something about the ALCS. While we were engaged in all this, we discovered that there was money in Germany from German PLR, which The German collecting society, VG Vort, could only pay to assist a collecting society, and we hadn't got one. So we then went to Germany and talked to Vort, the people there, got some advice from them about setting up these things and so on. And we then came back and we got about 4 or 5 people, mainly writers, but including my accountant, because I didn't have any money to put in, and my agent, to put in, I think it was £250 each, and the wonderful lawyer Jack Black drew up the articles and registered the company, and there we were on our way. And all I can say is I suppose I've been involved with it ever since.
Thank you, Maureen. And now I'd like to introduce Barbara Hayes before letting Maureen and Barbara take the conversation away and dig down into some of the themes that they're going to cover here. Barbara is the international and the current working CEO of the UK Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, and there are such societies all over the world. They essentially take in payments from a variety of organisations and pay it back out to authors, and you should check and see if there is one in your territory, because these payments can add up. How it works is you join the society, you make a one-off payment, and then from there on they work on your behalf, taking in payments from, as I said, a variety of organisations and institutions all over the world. So most of our members find that they very quickly cover their society fees, and from then on it's money in the bank that you wouldn't otherwise have had. So Barbara joined the ALCS in the UK back in 2004 and has turned it into an extremely dynamic and creative organisation linked to all sorts of other similar organisations internationally, keeping an eye on WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organisation, and doing all sorts of very good work on behalf of authors. She has a particular interest too in accessibility and audiovisual for authors, and very pleased to have her here today to talk to Maureen, with whom she works extremely closely. They both share a mindset, and they both do great work. So over to you, Barbara.
I think when I got there, it was for us. It was all about communication and building up our membership base, etc. We pay out money for photocopying, scanning, audio-visual works, cable retransmission, and overseas public lending right, which ties in quite nicely with what Maureen has been saying. So as much as we have a UK public lending right over here, there are a number of them in Europe. In fact, to be quite honest, through a European directive, there should be a public lending right in every country in Europe, but that's a fight that we are still fighting. And Maureen and I have been at a recent... Yeah. It's one of those things that, you know, we've been going to the Commission, making sure that they understand that they need to implement the directive properly, and therefore should basically get a move on. It's been something like 20 odd years since the directive came out. So it's that kind of world that we're living in these days, where we are benefiting, or writers are benefiting from a lot of the work that authors like Maureen and her cohorts in WAG started off, and we're actually trying to take to the next stage. So whereas Maureen was talking about photocopying and computers, we are now living in that digital age, and we're trying to make sure that writers get paid for the uses, all uses of their works. So to do this in the UK, and I'll be specific in the UK right now, and then talk about some of the things that happen on an international basis. But in the UK, we have an organisation called the Copyright Licensing Agency that goes out and sells licences to schools, colleges, universities, businesses, government departments, National Health Service, and the money that they bring in is split between the publishers and the creators side, and ALCS make sure that our authors are paid. We've got something like over 90,000 authors. We're desperately trying to clamber up to that magical 100,000, and we just make sure that they get paid. We make payments twice a year. I think last year we paid out something close to £32 million to about 78,000 writer members. So, we hope that our members feel that we're doing a good job for them. We also work very closely with UK Public Lending Right to make sure that our members know that they can register for Public Lending Right in the UK and therefore benefit from the loans of their books in libraries.
Fantastic. So, do you have any thoughts about the future of, where things are going for authors and how, that was a project that essentially had two writers not got together and feeling, the way you and Bridget felt, it probably would never have happened. So, do you think there's a lot more authors could be doing to help themselves to ensure that they are actually getting more of the benefit from their work, especially now with the digital?
Well, they must make sure that they are registered with all the organisations that are likely to be holding money for them and eventually paying out. They must be registered with the ALCS, but of course this means that in the digital age, particularly, they have got to have the sort of identity that the digital world can recognise, and I'm afraid that means the ISBN is absolutely crucial.
So just explain what an ISBN is for those who might not be aware who are listening.
Well, it's an international identification number per title, and then per edition, because new editions can get new numbers. And it's centralised. If you start up a small independent publishing house, you can actually get a whole bunch of ISBNs, which you can issue to your authors. And so when I work in conjunction with the Pottery Press, and the artist there, they publish the work, and they provide the ISBN from their little clutch of ISBNs that they've got. But it is absolutely essential these days, both nationally and internationally, that you have that basic recognition, that number.
Very good. Barbara, will you talk to us a little bit about the International Authors Forum?
I will indeed.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's something, and it was another idea of Maureen's, actually, that got the International Authors Forum going. So she's a very creative person at the best of times. So this actually started off as a bit of a talking shop amongst a number of authors who attended the IFRO meetings, and IFRO is the International Federation of Reproduction Rights Organisations. Doesn't sound very sexy, but it's all around the photocopying, and people would come together and they would talk about the fact that the contracts weren't very fair, that authors weren't getting paid properly, and when you listen to all the instances of this, and it's not just writers, you're talking about visual artists, you are talking about journalists, you are talking about anybody who creates.
Yeah.
And it soon became very clear that people didn't really know their rights. And of course, when you are starting out, I think a lot of people are just so grateful that somebody is interested in their work that they'll sign away anything that's put in front of them. And quite often, it appeared that it was, an assignment of your copyright.
Yeah.
So that leaves the author in a very weak negotiating position. So for a few years, the International Authors Forum was more of a sharing of information, talking shop. And I think probably about 5 years ago, we set it up to be more structured with a steering committee, gave it a bit of purpose. looking at what we could do at the World Intellectual Property Organisation, which is where the main treaties are made. It's set in Geneva, or is located in Geneva, and we felt that it was important for authors to have a voice when these treaties were being made, mainly because a lot of the treaties and the changes that people wanted would potentially negatively affect authors' rights and authors' income as a result of that. And even now, today, we're dealing with issues at WIPO in Geneva, looking at exceptions for authors, for educational exceptions and libraries and archives. And of course, this is something that we want to make sure that when delegates, quite often who know nothing about copyright, are discussing the future of a particular treaty that may or may not affect authors, we try to make sure that the author's voice is heard there. There's a small number of authors' organisations that attend, but it's far currently outweighed by the number of librarian organisations that attend. And we want to make sure that we get the author's voice over there to just educate the delegate that if you are going to be making any recommendations or taking any particular stands that could affect authors' incomes, to remember that there is an author there. And horrifically, we've both Maureen and myself, when we've spoken to delegates, it's like, oh, well, we hadn't considered the author. And so that's what we're there to do, to educate them and make them think about how this might potentially affect the author. And the 59 members that we have at the International Authors Forum obviously feel the same. So the organisations who are our members, who I think their membership totals over 600,000 authors worldwide, at least there's a voice at WIPO who's talking up on behalf of the author.
Yeah,
Absolutely, an ally is a
Yes,
proud member.
you are indeed.
and WIPO, in case your listeners don't know, is a branch of UNESCO.
Interesting. And how much authority or weight does WIPO carry?
Enormous.
Fantastic.
Every country in the world is represented there.
Brilliant. One of the questions that we get asked a lot is whether authors should register their copyright.
In this country, there is no registration of copyright. It is yours as soon as you have created the work.
Some of our writers, though, they live here because they sell in the US or they sell in Canada or Australia or whatever, or all over the world. They worry that...
Right. If you're going to the US, you will need to register it there. Canada, I'm not sure, it's probably the same system, I would think. But definitely the US. But in this country and in Europe, it is not necessary.
Okay, that's great to know. Okay, so let's just finish up then with talking about, what do you see as the challenges for authors? You spoke about the importance of the ISBN. Do you see ways in which authors could be more helpful to themselves in terms of making sure that she's waving a little blue page around here. Okay, Barbara, hit us.
Within the International Authors Forum, as I say, we've got members from around the world, and we got a lot of the lawyers together to start looking at what typical contracts, if there is such a thing as a typical contract, might look across the globe. And I think there were so many variations, obviously, from continent to continent and country to country. But the International Authors Forum members came up with 10 principles for fair contracts, and I'm sure that's something that you could probably host on your website if that's at all possible. But he came up with 10 principles, and I could just very quickly go through them because I think they are headline principles, but it's education. It's about copyright education and what not to sign. So the principles are: contracts should not be forever. Authors should share in the success of their creation. Authors' copyright should be respected. The person being granted any right must use it or lose it. That's another thing that is very big. Certainly publishers ask for, and the license for a long time. Authors' work should reach its broadest possible audience. Contractual commitment to payment and regular payments reports for all uses of authors' works. Authorship and the integrity of the work should be respected. Authors' future availability and choice in the marketplace should be safeguarded. Clear contracts with defined terms for all parties, and a fair balance between risk and profit. And there's quite a few of those principles seem to be missing completely in some countries. So I think it's about authors knowing their rights and knowing that they can actually go in and negotiate. Don't be frightened of it. I'm sure Maureen may have more to say on that one, but I think hopefully this will help empower authors to know that they don't have to accept exactly what is put in front of them, and to be aware of assigning their copyright when they don't need to.
Yes, it does partly depend on what sort of Copyright Act they have, what kind of legislation. And for instance, in the US, there is one principle there which would come under the heading of moral rights, which the US does not have. The US doesn't, apart from California, does not recognise the Berne Convention on authors' rights. And of course in the UK, one of the things we have to look at with Brexit is that we are not bartered away by the government in return for a US trade agreement. And, you know, this may apply also to Canada, and we see what's happened with Bombardier, with Northern Ireland, that they believe they can slap on anything, you know, protectionism for US manufacturers and so on. And of course the big companies like Amazon and Google and so on are all American, and they get very shirty indeed when, for instance, the EU tries to charge them their proper rate of tax or whatever. And so, you know, we need as many voices as we can, and, you know, get involved. Wherever you are, get involved.
You've been listening to another great session brought to you by the Indie Author Fringe and the Alliance of Independent Authors, ALLI. You can find out more about both by visiting ALLI's Self-Publishing Advice Centre, www.selfpublishingadvice.org. Now, go write and publish.